broadcast.
And how?
Well, good afternoon. Well, I guess perhaps I'm up to bat first, Paula, and I guess I could just introduce myself really quickly. As you see here, I'm the Deputy Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada. I've been at the Conference Board for many years, and I thought I'd just take 1 second here in this next slide to show you, tell you a little bit about what we do. But we're essentially a not-for-profit research institute. Some people can think of us as a little bit like a think tank, but we are essentially very evidence-based, and we try to do research and in some instances policy advice really based on the evidence and a balanced look at the work. At the research that we're doing. In addition, and especially in my world, I do a lot of economic forecasting, and so our economics division focuses essentially on economic trends, that first piece of what we do here at the board. More broadly, organizational performance, industry strategy, and public policy, as I mentioned. But I do feel that in the economics division, we have a real advantage around being able to produce essentially services for our client base, which are based on essentially economic forecasts that we do at the regional level. We do these at the metro level. We dig very deep into Canadian industries. And so we do a lot of work really around digging deep into the economic environment here in Canada. And as you may know, or as you may have heard in some instances, there is some critique about economists. You know, we're always focusing in on the dollar. We're always looking at GDP in a sense, and focused on this kind of consumer and spending perspective around what drives the economy and other things. So it was a real pleasure when Paula and Volunteer Canada came to me and asked us if we would be willing to do something a little bit different and look a little more broadly at the value of volunteering in Canada. So if we look at this next slide here, you know, we thought, and I thought personally, that this was a great opportunity for us economists to redeem ourselves a little bit and not just think about the dollars and cents, and think a little more broadly about how volunteering does in fact lend itself to contributing very tangible benefits, and in fact very tangible services to the many Canadians across this country that benefit from that. And it is in fact really appropriate to measure and compare the value of these services. Now, when we think about, as I mentioned, GDP, the expenditure-based economy, in essence, everything that, or a lot of the things that Statistics Canada produces when generating the economic accounts, the GDP numbers per se, these are based essentially on monetary transactions. So anything that is not a monetary transaction, like volunteering, doesn't really get counted and measured within those economic accounts. So we thought, well, this is very valuable. This is an opportunity to kind of gain some understanding and perspective about how large this sector really is, and how large or how much this sector does really contribute in terms of the value of services that it brings. So certainly, in my opinion, a valued undertaking. And we started with essentially what you see on this table, which is some information from the General Social Survey that Statistics Canada produces. This is a survey specifically on the value of volunteering and giving and participating. And from this survey, which is occasional, and you can see the data here up until 2013, it tells us a little bit about the number of volunteers in Canada, the volunteer rate, and the average number of hours that people volunteer in Canada. And what you see is, in fact, that the numbers are really impressive. In fact, I was surprised at how much contribution we have just in terms of the overall volunteer participation rate, which as you can see is about 43.6% in 2013. We actually wanted to look at these data, extend them to a more recent year. We don't have a survey yet for 2017, so we wanted to extend that data, and we did so by looking essentially at the demographics. We know that volunteer rates or participation rates for volunteering are available from the survey through by age cohort, and so we know that the demographics in Canada very well. We know that the aging boomers are continuing to age, and we essentially took the participation rates by age and applied those to our 2017 demographics to get the overall volunteer rate. Now, you may or may not know, in fact, that the highest share of or highest participation rates for volunteering, if you look at these surveys, are in the 15 to 19 age cohort. I don't know if it's in part because there's some commitments there with respect to high school programs and others, but nonetheless, about 66% of the youths in that age group volunteer, and volunteer rates in the 55 and over are about 40%. So it's slightly less in terms of the total number of participants, but in terms of the average hour contributed, we know that young people perhaps have less time, whereas people 55 and over tend to contribute a fair bit more. So in fact, young people 15 to 19 contribute about 110 hours per year, whereas the 55 and over, we're starting to talk around 200 hours. So doing all of the demographics around that, we get the total volunteer rate. We know, we apply that by age and gender with the average number of hours of volunteering per those demographic cohorts, and we land up with this number of 2 million hours of volunteer work per year, and that's our estimate for 2017. This represents essentially, if we take the average number of hours that people work in full and part-time employment. So in comparison to total employment in the country, we work on average 33 hours. That gives us a number of about 1.2 million of people employed. So as you can see here, just in terms of the roundup of the numbers, 13.3 million Canadians volunteered. That's 44% of the population 15 and over. This is equivalent to 1.1 million working full-time. That's about 37 hours. Or if we're using a mix of full and part-time, we're talking about 1.2 million people employed. This is where I was surprised. This is about 6.5% of total employment. So for comparison, this is about the equivalent of everyone employed in the educational sector, for example. If we add the volunteer work effort employment with the nonprofit sector, now the nonprofit sector is transactional in nature, so we do have that data in the accounts. We know what it's worth in terms of its employment and GDP, and we get, adding both those up, we get about 1.8 million jobs. So on this next slide, you can see just a chart here of essentially the volunteer work, which, as I mentioned, is about 1.2 million people employed. That compares to the following industries in that way. So about the equivalent of educational services, or just slightly less. But if we look at the nonprofit institutions, last from the bottom, that's another 600 and some odd thousand jobs in 2017. Add those two together, you're at 1.8 million. That's almost, in fact, that's larger than the manufacturing sector as a whole. So that gives you some sense of weight and contribution of what volunteering does to the Canadian economy. If we go to the next slide here, we just summarize some of that. We calculated again, going back to my roots around measuring everything in dollars and cents, we want to take that employment and those hours and try and get a sense of what that means for GDP. Now, we wanted to be conservative. When you think about people volunteering, in some respects, some people bring great expertise and skills, but you know, if we have, for example, an engineer or a doctor working in volunteering, we have to wonder, should we apply their average wage, or should we apply an average wage that's more reflective of the services they're offering? So I think at the what we did essentially was look at the average wage in the volunteer in the volunteer sector, which is fairly, which at $27 is significantly lower than the economy-wide 35.5 wage. Now, we felt that this would be a conservative estimate, but despite that being a conservative estimate, we find that volunteering adds essentially $56 billion to economic activity in Canada. So it's a sizable amount, and I'll show you some comparisons in a second of just how big that is. But if we again add that with the nonprofit sector, which is transactional and is available, we get essentially 86 or almost $87 billion contributed to the economy. So on the next slide, we kind of summarize that. You can see here the total value of volunteer time, and again, we convert that all to dollars. We get 30 billion in the nonprofit sector, plus plus the 55.9 billion that we talked about. As a share of total GDP, just the volunteer effort, 2.6% of GDP, and you can see that it's grown at about 3.4% annually in nominal terms, in current dollar terms. And as a share of total GDP, if we add in the nonprofit sector, we're at 4% of GDP. But that's not all. That's not all. And if we look at the next slide, in fact, in the report that we did, we also took a look at some of the intangibles that are not necessarily valued in those pieces that we just looked at. So this summarizes what I've just told you. In the next slide, we talk about these pieces that are the intangibles. So the broader benefits of volunteering. So if we could just go to the next slide. Yeah. Oh, I think we've missed a slide. Did I get the broader benefits of volunteering? I think it's one slide back. In any case, what we found, oh, apologies, I think for some reason that slide is missing, but I'll summarize real quickly, Paula, before I pass it to you. In essence, what we were trying to look at are some of the intangibles, and we know that Canadians volunteer, for example, because they want to make a positive contribution to the community, and we, as I mentioned, saw the huge and measurable benefits in terms of the value of those services. We also know that when people volunteer, that volunteering often pushes those people outside of their comfort zones, and it helps them develop new business relevant skills, and we've seen research that suggests that this lifts their earning capacities. So both individuals and corporations benefit from volunteering, not just in the sense of their community and social responsibility, but also in a very real sense in terms of the skills and I guess employability skills and skills developed by the volunteers themselves. We also have seen studies that show that volunteering can contribute to better health and well-being, and it does. There's been studies looking at specific segments of the population and how those segments benefit, both in terms of new immigrants, for example, in terms of seniors, encouraging them to stay active, and we see the benefits in terms of their health in those studies. And finally, I think we are seeing a trend where more and more workplaces are seeing the benefits of this. They're involved in corporate social responsibility, and they're encouraging and making available time for their staff to be able to take on more and more in terms of volunteering. So these are all very positive pieces, some measurable, and some of these broader intangible benefits that are also very important. And Paula, I'm sure you're going to tell us a lot more as well about the benefits in terms of the service provider to the recipients of those services as well. So I'll pass that on to you.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you so much. I wanted to really thank the conference board and Pedro in particular and his team for collaborating with us on this study, because it really, we worked well in terms of complementing each other's perspectives and skills, and I think that we've covered the range of value and impact between us fairly well, but we also invite the rest of you to add to that, because as Pedro was saying, this is, we're only beginning to get our heads around all the different layers of benefits. I also wanted to recognize Investors Group Wealth Management for supporting the research and really leading the way with a lot of the thinking and expanding our knowledge and definition of what volunteering is and what role it plays for us. And volunteer centers that have been very active, 220 volunteer centers around the country, contributing to this research and this thinking. So with that, for those of you who aren't familiar with Volunteer Canada, you may know, again, we collaborate with volunteer centers around the country, and we provide national leadership and expertise on volunteerism. And our aim is not necessarily to increase the number of volunteers or increase the number of hours, but really to look at it as increasing the participation, the quality of the experience, and the diversity of volunteer experiences. So that's what we're about, and we'll move on to the presentation. So before I get into the value of volunteering, I wanted to provide some context to our journey of looking at this area. As many of you know, the notion of volunteering and the definition of volunteering has really evolved over the years. And in fact, there are some people who would suggest that the term volunteering is outdated and that we ought to use other terms like engagement or citizen participation. And all those terms are certainly valid. Our thinking was that at this point we could expand the definition of volunteering itself rather than every few years look at another term. And then our interest in the definition came from people's feedback about recruitment and recognition, because people didn't necessarily see what they were doing as volunteering, and people weren't recognizing it in others because of, as I said, the changing nature. So with that, I'll give you a little bit of information about our journey in looking at the definition, and that you'll see leads into our expanded scope of looking at the value in many ways. So we did have a roundtable in 2011 with the Governor General, David Johnston, and when we asked people what they saw in terms of the future of volunteering, people really talked about that expanding definition, that there were a lot more informal, organic movements happening, that were happening outside of organizations, and that were very much a part of how we showed caring, how we participated in our communities and shaped them. So that was one thing. The other thing was that when we looked at the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement and some of the language we had been using previous to 2012, really captured only a narrow definition of volunteering. Whether you say it's traditional and the roles people play in organizations, we're not suggesting that they're no longer relevant. The expansion really is expanding the definition to include more activities and recognize what people do formally and informally. So when you look at what's going around the world in terms of that, there are many ways that countries are measuring volunteering, measuring giving, whether it's looking at how we care and who's the most caring country. But there's definitely a recognition that we express our values in more ways than our formal roles within organizations. And so we have, if you go on the links to some of the studies referenced on the slide, you could see what some of the thinkers have been looking at. When we looked at recognizing volunteering in 2017, this is something we did with Ipsos Reid Public Affairs, and really were able to illustrate that change. So I'll go on to the next slide. So again, as Pedro was saying, that the formal volunteering that was captured in the General Social Survey of Giving and Volunteering in 2013 by StatsCan identified 12.7 million Canadians volunteering. And some of you may recall that in 2010, so the survey that was done a few years before that actually had a higher volunteer rate and had identified more Canadians volunteering. And so when we had this this finding that had showed a reduction in the number of volunteers and the volunteer rate, there were many people very concerned. Are people less caring? Do they not want to help one another? What is going on in communities? And as we did our research, we saw that it's not so much that people are less caring or less active. In fact, the opposite. It's just that the way and the vehicle through which people are expressing their values and their caring towards either neighbors, family members, social networks, their planet, their community, it's very different, and it's not being captured in the formal surveys. So here are some examples, as many of you know, that people are either through social media or other means, they're mounting public awareness campaigns. They're having significant impact on public policy simply by raising awareness and raising issues and mobilizing people either to attend events, to fundraise. People are having a lot of success and, in fact, a lot of satisfaction by being able to self-organize and see that impact. And again, the same goes for, as I said, fundraising through crowdsourcing and other means. And when you look at how we talk about businesses, and Pedro mentioned corporate social responsibility earlier, we understand that to mean a variety of things in a business. So their purchasing decisions in terms of will they purchase from a supplier that does not have the human rights or diversity policies that are up to their standards, in terms of their environmental practices, their own hiring practices, their relationship with community, where they donate money, the pro bono work that they do, and the manner in which they support employees to volunteer. All those things are understood to be part of corporate social responsibility, and it's not only about donating, and it's not only about the number of hours that people volunteer. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see that we're looking at a parallel between corporate social responsibility in business entities and individuals. And so the term individual social responsibility emerged and is also seen to be more encompassing than formal volunteering in organizations and charitable donations to charities or nonprofit organizations, but it really looks at all the decisions we make throughout the day. And so when you think about waking up in the morning and you are composting your orange peel, on the way to work you might walk or carpool, you may stop for coffee only at a coffee shop that has employment practices that you feel comfortable with and that provides coffee that is from sources that are socially responsible and fair trade, and so on. So the decisions we make throughout the day really do reflect our value in more ways than what is formal. So that's where we came to that definition. And as you can see, it's our relationship with community, with those that we have contact with, that really can take different forms. So we'll go on to the next slide. So the question I have, and again, for us, this first piece, revisiting the nature of volunteering and its definition, the question is, does this resonate with you, and what has been your experience? So some of you who are participating today are in organizations responsible for engaging volunteers. Others are involved with boards, perhaps you're teaching volunteer resource management or nonprofit management or business. Perhaps you're in a business that's encouraging people to volunteer or responsible for corporate social responsibility. My question to you is, have you seen this trend? Have you seen the trend towards people expressing their social values in a variety of ways outside those formal opportunities to donate or to volunteer? And I'll take a moment to pause so that you can think about that and respond, but as well to see if there are any questions at this time.
Great. I do have a question, actually, if Pedro is willing to jump in on this one. We had a question wondering if some of the stats that you were presenting, if there were differences seen between the provinces, or if there was any regional differences.
Oh, that's a good question. I think in general, when we look at the pattern of volunteering across the different age cohorts, we're not really, we're seeing things that are relatively stable. The data does get a little looser with respect to the provincial breakdown. So it's something that I'd have to dig in to see if there was anything out, that would be of note to reflect there. But yeah, I think I'd have to kind of summarize it at that. I don't have enough information to be able to really highlight anything very different. I know that the demographics in general are pretty much the same.
Awesome, thank you.
And if I can add to that, in terms of the breakdown in volunteer rate, there is a significant range, and in fact that speaks to what we were just discussing. So for example, in Quebec, the volunteer rate is 32%, which is seen to be, of people 15 and over, which is seen to be the lowest in the country, whereas in Saskatchewan it's 56%, probably the highest in the country. And many people feel that it's the social structure in Quebec that is somewhat different, as well as the public services that are available, that creates the lower rate in formal volunteering in organizations. So again, there are a lot of differences, and we could circulate some tables afterwards if that's of interest to people.
Excellent. Thanks, Paula. So just speaking to some of the questions that you were asking there to the group. So we have a wonderful response from Lindsay, who works for a food bank, and says they are finding that the trends are changing and it's becoming increasingly difficult to recruit people to come in once a week, every week. They do have a lot of interest from high school students, but they have limited roles for them as the food bank operates during business hours. But they are seeing a lot of community engagement in other ways, such as food drives in the school, at companies, social media campaigns, things like that.
Oh, great examples.
Yeah, excellent examples. We also have folks commenting on the popularity of things like GoFundMe accounts and crowdsourcing on social media being a trend. And Michelle says, technology has enabled individuals to campaign independently of an organizational structure, which I think is a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think all of us in different ways have seen some changes, and in some ways we may be nervous and I wouldn't go so far as to say panicking, but when you see that people can do really great things outside of organizations and then wonder, does that leave our organizations vulnerable? And in some ways, I think what we need to do is think about how we embrace and make space for people within our organizations to be creative and to self-organize. But also at the same time to recognize if our goal is to make our communities better and people are doing it different ways, then that's something we should all celebrate. Nevertheless, we do have the reality of wanting to recruit people to do the very important work that we have through our programs and services. So it's a matter of being creative and flexible, and I think some people are doing some really neat things. So shall we move on?
Sounds great.
Okay, so that led us to really think about if the nature of volunteering has changed, and if we're seeing and becoming more aware of the benefits to everybody in the system of volunteering, how do we really understand and demonstrate the value and the impact. And so in thinking about that, traditionally, and as Pedro was saying, we've thought about looking at the volunteer time that's being contributed and putting a value to that. All of us understanding that there's really more to it than that. So we started by saying, okay, if we agree that that volunteering has value to the organizations where people are volunteering, to neighborhoods where people live, to businesses, to society at large, and to all those volunteering, then we really need to think of those things both separately and integrated. So we'll move on to the next slide and look at some of the models. So again, building on what Pedro was saying, the more typical traditional way of looking at calculating volunteer time was either wage replacement. So you might say if people are volunteering 10 hours a week, and if they were paid $20 an hour, then that has a value of $200. So, you know, wage replacement. The other one is looking at market value. If somebody is providing a tutoring session, how much does a tutoring session normally cost? And we could say that that hour of tutoring is worth $40, $50 if that's the market value for a tutoring session. The third way people are using in terms of, again, calculating an economic value is looking at return on investment. And that tries to estimate what is the savings to society when somebody's circumstance improves as a result of the volunteering. So, for example, if somebody is volunteering to coach someone in interviews and to find employment, then after that person has successfully found employment as a result of that intervention, then perhaps they are less dependent on society for support services. And so that's another way to look at that. But we all know, again, as valid as that is and as important as that is, it is really greater than that. So let's look at the following slide. So that led us at Volunteer Canada, in collaboration with the conference board, to really try and segment all the various components. So we looked at what is the research that is available to us that demonstrates the value of volunteering to volunteers themselves, to organizations, to businesses, to neighborhoods, and society. And so the wheel that we created here, if you look at it on our website, if you click on any of those elements, that will lead you to research in that area. So for example, if you're interested in knowing what's the skills development benefit of volunteering to volunteers, you click on that, and that will take you to some really good research on how volunteering creates that value through skills development. So let's look at each of those components separately. So if we look at the value of volunteering to organizations, you look at volunteers, for example, who are in leadership and governance positions. We'll use that as an example. They set strategic direction, they raise needed funds, they form alliances, they open doors, there's the fiscal oversight, raising the profile of organizations, and really bringing perspectives from different places in the community. And so when you think about the value of that, it really goes beyond how many hours does someone spend reading materials before a meeting or attending a meeting. And so here you can see we're trying to get at not just the value of the time somebody spends, but what is the impact of that time spent. So let's look at the next sphere. And you can look at neighborhoods. Some of you who have done community development work and followed these trends know that in neighborhoods where there's a higher level of engagement and participation, that there is a sense of people feeling safer. There's a greater sense of resiliency. And whether you talk about social capital or community engagement, there really is more capacity for people living in neighborhoods together to be able to rely on each other and to reach out to each other and to benefit from either the skills and aptitudes or other services that people can informally barter for one another. When people volunteer together, there's also a sense of trust and bonding that is created. And again, when you look at volunteering, it goes beyond if you volunteered for the barbecue or the number of hours you spent at the homework club. While though that is very commendable and something to celebrate, really looking at the impact of that in neighborhoods is something that that demonstrates the value in a more fulsome way. And then for businesses, it looks at that in many ways. So some of you may be involved through a business in community investment or employer-supported volunteering, or perhaps you are an employee or you work in a nonprofit where people from businesses have come together to volunteer. And it was surprising for us to note that a third of the 12.7 million Canadians volunteering indicate that they have their support from their employer. So that's really significant. And why do they do it? A variety of reasons, but some of the very concrete benefits they have cited in different studies, the ability to recruit top talent, that people searching for positions will choose a place of employment that matches their values or gives them an opportunity to express their values through the workplace over one that doesn't. And in some studies have even indicated that they will take a somewhat lower salary if they feel there's more of an alignment between their values and the values of the company. And in terms of employee engagement, a lot of research shows that people are more engaged, more likely to refer others to that company, and to really participate in other ways, and increased attendance and higher productivity. There are a lot of values there. So again, you could see that if you just looked at how much does it cost for a business to release their employees for 10 hours a month, you might be able to come up with a wage replacement value, but these values are really also remarkable. And value to society. Many people have seen really significant public policy campaigns through volunteers that have improved legislation around things like impaired driving or end-of-life support or the use of pesticides on public spaces. And these have been really significant because when individuals organize together and momentum is built and there's real passion and understanding of the impact, then people are receptive to hearing the stories from people who are most affected by those issues. And they have had great success in getting the ears of policymakers. So again, if we were to just count the hours that they spend writing briefs or attending meetings, that would be one way to calculate it, but the impact is tremendous. I mean, lives have been saved, people's health has been improved, and so on. And so here we go, not last, but all-encompassing, is looking at what is the impact to those who volunteered. And Pedro covered some of that earlier in terms of health benefits, learning, skills, advances in education or careers, and improved self-esteem. Some of the things that we're finding with this one in particular, because people have asked, how do we measure this and how do we monitor this? One of the practices that we've heard about is that when somebody starts to volunteer and in the interview process, they'll be asked, what is your goal in volunteering? And if someone says, I'm interested in gaining new skills or meeting new people or getting more comfortable with a second language, then 3 months, 6 months, a year later, they'll be surveyed and asked, has volunteering helped you achieve these goals? And that's a way to be able to demonstrate what percentage of people who are interested in learning new skills, has volunteering really done that for them? So while these things seem intangible, there are ways that people are starting to measure them. So with that, my question to you is it important to calculate the value of volunteering in this multifaceted way? Whose ear do you need to have in terms of being able to demonstrate that value and impact? And how can we demonstrate the impact, not just the value of volunteering? What are some of the creative ways that you have started to undertake in order to demonstrate that impact? So I'm hoping, I know many of you have already done some significant work in this area. So this is the opportunity to share what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paula. Yes, we've already got Andrew is commenting about how this is helpful for applying for grants and showing, the volunteer labor that is almost like an in-kind donation in a way. So that's an important one, I would think. Yes, and Richard says very important to put a dollar value on volunteering. Is there any way that this should be reflected on the T3010 that gets filed at the end of the year? Any thoughts on that? I'm guessing not.
The T3010 does ask to indicate numbers of volunteers. That is something that started with, I think it was about 6 years ago, but it's not asking for a calculation of value or impact, but it does ask to indicate the level of engagement or the scope of engagement.
Excellent, excellent. Here's a great comment from Vanessa. In our area, we report both volunteer contribution and volunteer accomplishments to demonstrate the program performance in our organization. So that's a wonderful way of looking at it on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's jump into a couple of questions here while folks are typing in their answers. So is there a suggestion for, a lot of what you've presented here today is talking about the changing nature of volunteering. And we've had a couple of people indicate that perhaps the leadership at their organization still is holding some old-fashioned views about what volunteering actually looks like. Do you have any tips for sort of helping to educate folks that might not be in the trenches on volunteer management, but might be making some higher level decisions around volunteer programs?
One of the things that some people have started to do is to share some of the studies or make a small presentation, and people are welcome to use any of the material that we've produced. It's all public, and that might be one way to do that. Sometimes, whether it's a mini presentation or a small brief, it often helps organizations when they hear that other organizations in the field are moving on this. And I think that most board members want to know that they're current and cutting edge and being proactive in responding to the trends. So I think that it's a matter of raising awareness.
Great. And on that note, the volunteer wheel that you shared, Paula, is that, can organizations share that as long as they're providing credit for
Absolutely.
The source? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. So that's wonderful. So that's a wonderful resource to be able to share as well. On the tax note, are there any updates on volunteers being able to actually claim their volunteer hours as any kind of a tax credit? I know that was being talked about at one point.
Mm-hmm. So there has been a lot of work, and there are a number of people that are really concerned about the fact that there's a tax benefit for those who make financial contributions and not for those who make contributions of time. So as many of you know, volunteer firefighters, as well as those who are emergency responders, have been able to get a tax credit for time, to a limit, but many people feel that that's not enough, that it should be a broader scope. One of the challenges with that, again, it's not to diminish the value of volunteering, but there are people who feel that by implementing a broad-based credit for volunteer time would create a lot of onerous administration for nonprofit organizations. Secondly, would it be only for those who are registered charities? What about those who volunteer their time outside of organizations? So I think the complexity of it has come in the way of finding a solution to that. But there's also philosophical reasons why some people feel that volunteer time and participation really should not have a financial benefit, so to speak, because a tax credit would constitute some kind of financial benefit. So it's complicated practically, philosophically, and ethically, for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when we're talking about providing value to our volunteers by also looking at their accomplishments, do we have any sort of tools or tips for folks to be able to track and document accomplishments, hours, things like that?
There are many. Oh, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think just the fact of recording and tracking in a consistent way would go a long ways to being able to measure some of these benefits. And if we had more of that data kind of on a firm by firm basis, you know how good Stats Can is to all of a sudden when they discover there's information to collect it themselves, and we can get better estimates on a more global basis. But certainly I think just the fact that people take the time to record and they record in a consistent way would be beneficial.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of folks chiming in today on the importance of that measurement for their funding. So we've had a number of comments come in talking about how tracking these things is so important for accessing grant funding and showing results. Paula, do you want to maybe speak to that as well?
Absolutely. I think that when an organization proposes a new program, it really makes a difference to show that there's community support and engagement of people involved in that issue. So from that point of view, it demonstrates the relevance and community support for the idea. And secondly, it demonstrates the assets that that organization already has access to by virtue of those who are volunteering, and shows that the grant that they would receive would really be effective in leveraging tenfold the impact that they can have by virtue of the volunteers involved. So that's absolutely true.
Great. And here's another wonderful benefit that folks might not have thought about, but Rachel says workplaces such as banks sometimes make donations to organizations where their employees volunteer. So, we're also looking at this as it's not necessarily just volunteer hours, correct? I mean, there's a real financial aspect as well.
Yes, so sometimes that's referred to as Dollars for Doers, this type of program, and there are a number of businesses that do support. It's a way of recognizing the volunteering and that the employee is doing, but it's also a way to involve employees in determining where charitable dollars from that business is directed, because if an employee is volunteering somewhere, then that's obviously a priority for them, either the issue or the organization itself. And so that's really a great way to almost democratize the whole community investment, the charitable donations, by having a portion of the budget go towards those programs.
Great. And I love this comment from Jeremy, who says, nothing works better than testimonials of the volunteers and participants of our program to show the total impact of the power of volunteering. So we've had some other comments along those lines as well, that there really seems to be a need to marry the stats and the hours and the economic impact with also the storytelling and the personal impact that's given there. So perhaps you could talk to that too, Paula.
I think we underestimate narratives and testimonials and stories. I think that comment is absolutely true, because we can relate to hearing a story about how something made a difference to somebody's life, whereas when you hear stats, you might be impressed by them, but in terms of it being inspiring and motivating and something that we can relate to as people, I think that the stories really do illustrate that, absolutely.
Great. And here's a question for Pedro. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about how you came up with the value for the volunteer hours? So I think the question we had, and I'm not sure if I have these numbers right, but said that the hourly wage was valued at, it was higher than minimum wage, correct, for the volunteer hours?
Yes. So we had essentially we used the wage that is the hourly wage in the nonprofit sector, which is $27 per hour.
Okay.
And it's about 76% of the economy-wide wage, which is 35.5. So it goes to the point of we're valuing the service. I mean, an example would be somebody who's volunteering in a soup kitchen. You know, do you value their wage at? It could be a doctor or an engineer. Do you value their wage there, or do you value the wage at the within the nonprofit sector? So we chose the lesser because we wanted to be conservative around the estimates. But I think if anything, there are people that are working with their skill set in the volunteer sector and adding perhaps more than we've accounted for.
That makes sense. So on that note, do you have any tips for organizations about how they can better calculate the economic impact of their volunteer programs?
Well, I think this is I mean, they could certainly use our template here, which is if they keep track of the number of hours or volunteer hours from their staff, they could certainly use the kind of conference board template, which would be valuing it at this wage. And we have the wage over time. And in fact, in the table, I present some of the data there, but we have that is data from the LFS, the Labor Force Survey in Canada, which is a monthly survey even, but we would be able to provide folks with that wage over time, and they could look at their contribution over time.
Great. Okay, so moving a little bit away from economic stuff. So any tips on how to help motivate or show volunteers their value that goes beyond money? So that may be related to what we were talking about with storytelling, but are there any other suggestions there?
One of the things that we've heard about from a couple of organizations in Calgary actually is they've started to give out impact statements to volunteers every 6 months. And what they've done, and one was a tutoring organization, where what they did was they did a quick survey, parents, teachers of students receiving tutoring, and asked questions about whether attendance has improved, whether they perceived attitude to be improved, and whether their achievement in school grades have improved. And so then what they've done is said to volunteers in that program, over the past 6 months, your volunteer tutoring has increased the students in this program. Their attendance has increased by 15%, their marks have increased by 20%, and parents and teachers have noticed that their attitude about learning has improved, 70%. So that kind of impact, and in fact, the research we've done at Volunteer Canada about volunteer recognition indicates that knowing the impact of what you've done in volunteering is the greatest form of recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now moving a little bit away from the value that volunteering brings, looking at the other side of it, is there any research that's been done on the cost of volunteering, or specifically the cost to organizations, i.e. are there times where it's actually maybe not economical for an organization to be taking on more volunteers?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that is a tough question. I'm not sure that I've seen any research specifically looking at that in the and literature that we looked at. I would argue, though, that again, putting my economist hat on, that firms are profit maximizers, and not to be kind of taking a nasty look at this, but essentially they are looking out for their interests, which is to maximize their profitability. And the way they do that is essentially through corporate social responsibility. I think it is a piece that firms consider as an investment to better their standing in the community, to have real effect, and that often comes from the executive and the CEO, that they really want to do something societally, but they're also thinking about the image of the corporation in terms of attracting talent, as Paula referred to, but also in the market in terms of consumer preferences and consumers being aware of a company having a local impact in their community.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to pop in the chat box just as soon as I grab it here. We did do a webinar with Volunteer Canada last year on how to engage employer-supported volunteers, because we do find, and I know Paula can speak to this, that it is a challenge for many organizations that businesses do want to come in and do, especially group volunteering opportunities. And sometimes it can be a challenge for organizations to be able to accommodate that. So Paula, could you speak to that maybe? And I'll put that past recording in the chat box as well.
Some of you may be familiar with the Volunteer Canada's Corporate Council on Volunteering, which has leading businesses that have well-established employer-supported volunteering programs. And over the last 5 years or more, the issue of the gap between nonprofits and businesses that are trying to engage with one another was identified. And so together, the Council with Volunteer Canada created the Canadian Code for Employer-Supported Volunteering, which really set the framework for a reciprocal relationship. How do you make sure that your business objectives through employee volunteering are aligned with the mission and objectives of the organization? And so how can you be sensitive to the capacity, the timing, the resources required? And I think that many businesses have come a long way in understanding the issues in context of an organization and vice versa, and there's a lot more dialogue where you're negotiating so that everyone's needs are met. You're not just being affected by a power imbalance and thinking about it as we're all here for community. But there's some great templates on Volunteer Canada's website that have good information about how do you ensure, how do you broker that, how do you navigate that.
Excellent. Thank you, Paula. So I think we're going to leave it there. That's great. And I do encourage everyone to visit the Volunteer Canada website, because there is a ton of fantastic research and information there. So definitely go give that a check at volunteer.ca. So I want to thank you again, Paula, Pedro. This has been a great webinar. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful. And before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone we're going to follow up with you by email tomorrow with the webinar recording. We'll include the short survey there. It takes just less than 5 minutes to fill out. I hope that you'll do that for us. You'll have an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in a future session. So take a minute to fill that out for us. For those of you that haven't yet checked out our new podcast, The Small Nonprofit, this week you're definitely going to want to give it a listen. We're interviewing Camara Chambers, who's the Executive Director at Volunteer Toronto. So it is all about volunteer management this week, packed with great tips on recruitment, screening, and managing difficult volunteers. And we'll include a link to that in the email we send tomorrow as well, in case you'd like to give that a listen. And finally, we're on a little break now until our next webinar, which isn't until November 22nd, but we'll be welcoming back presenter Marlene Oliveira, who has presented for Charity Village many times in the past and is always popular. She's going to be talking about storytelling. And again, that's November 22nd, and I will include a link to that webinar and registration in the email that you get tomorrow as well. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.